In this next video, I'm going to be talking about the psychological, but I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I'm going to be talking about it more in terms of civil, ethical, and moral relations and associations. And so I've talked previously about the harm principle, but two other additional principles that are very, very important and which I've talked with the harm principle. So I've talked about proportionality, I've talked about severity, but when we're talking about universals and we're talking about um, like a closer true civility or ethic or morality, something that actually promotes good, not just within the self, but the self and the surroundings and within others and another who has a self, where we recognize the self, develop awareness of the self within the self and another, and relate it to individuality as well as individuality's relation to diversity and being able to respect diversity and build healthy relations between individuals and recognize the self within another through this individual through perceptions, motivations, emotions, feelings, actions, behaviors directly involving individuality, which allows us to appreciate and develop meaning and value regarding diversity and diverse relationships through that recognition of self and these differences that exist, as well as similarity that we can form more of these um, we can form positive relationships between both the differences and the similarities. And this cultivates a greater sense of between the individuality and diversity, um, uh, these healthier civil, ethical, and moral relations. And that's primarily done through these two principles, additional principles. There's the moral imperative that was put forth by the philosopher Kant, uh, Immanuel Kant, and that's treating others not as a means to an end, but an end in themselves. And it's treating your perceptions, motivations, emotions, actions, and behaviors as in terms of relation to civil, ethical, and moral conduct, various forms of expression, self-expressions, and embodiments, as universal principles. So this requires us to take a step back and to meta perceive ourselves in relation to these civil, ethical, and moral conditions and situations in which we have to really consider the nature of harm and proportionality and severity before we go about operating in the world in any way, because there are consequences to the way that we function and operate. But that's just more of a summary about that. In the focus of this video, I want to talk about a concept I'm introducing that is very similar to this, because there's a subjective and an objective component to that, because we're perceptual and psychological beings, right? And so I want to talk about the psychological in terms of when we're looking at civility, ethics, and morality. And the psychological, again, it has to do with this subjective objective continuum and the relations between that. So when you think of the harm principle or proportionality or even severity, it always falls within a perceptual and a psychological apparatus too, because we have, when we're thinking about individuality in the self within the self, another, or others, we have to think about the differences between harm and perceptions, motivations, emotions, feelings, actions, and behaviors related to that, as well as the self that's being harmed, as well as proportionality and severity of that, and the various contingencies, situations, and conditions that kind of impact that, which all fall under the psychological, and which have subjective and objective aspects of that. For example, if you're somebody who's complaining a lot, this is probably going to fall under the subjective more frequently. And we see that a great amount of psychological distress tends to be associated with things like complaints or blame, self blame, blaming others, um, various forms of denial, various forms of neglect and ignorance that have more to do also with these attachments and even perfectionisms that arise. And when we can form proper, healthier relationships within the self, um, that can give space to that and to loosen up these attachments and even detach from certain perceptions, motivations, emotions, feelings, actions, and behaviors, we can grant ourselves some space and to cultivate this meta perception that allows us to build more of these healthier, positive relationships within various positive perceptions, positive motivations, positive emotions, positive feelings, positive actions, and positive behaviors that promote more of this civil, ethical, and moral conduct, primarily through the psychological and through understanding individuation within ourselves and between others and across others, as well as uh, individuality that directly relates to an integrated notion of diversity within the self and that can be practiced uh, within the surroundings and surrounding environment. And a person who's very integrated in terms of the self tends to have more of a healthy integration of the psychological within their everyday life. And that's a recognition of both the subjective and objective aspects related to things like harm, proportionality, and severity that have direct manifestations and connections and associations to the civil, ethical, and moral conduct that we go about in our everyday and relate directly to things like self recognition, self awareness, and self regulation and recognition of the self and awareness of the self, not just within the self, but another and others, with less focus actually, and in most cases, in probably almost all cases, abstaining from self regulation of others, because that's not your job. Your job is to regulate yourself, and my job is to regulate myself, not to regulate you. And if we're appreciating individuality, oftentimes that recognition and awareness that require for that civil, ethical, and moral conduct requires recognizing the self and developing awareness of the self, but then taking this meta perception where we can appreciate the psychological, the subjective object, and recognize that if we're going to conduct ourselves in a civil, ethical, or moral manner, it's going to start with these self recognition and this self intelligence that has a component of self awareness, self knowledge, and understanding ourselves deeply and what promotes positive perceptions, positive motivations, positive feelings, actions, and behaviors within the self, and a positive self within the self, promoting positive well being. And that alone can be very conducive to promoting civil, ethical, and moral behavior that can promote positive well being not just within the self, but in other and others. And that's all I wanted to say in this video. I hope you enjoyed.